Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and really get to the heart of complex global issues. Today, we're plunging into a region that's, well, it's absolutely critical, the Gulf monarchies. What if the stability we often took for granted there was actually more fragile than we thought, shattered and totally reconfigured over just one turbulent decade? Our mission for you today is to unpack these huge shifts in how they see security, how they conduct foreign policy, and importantly, why that matters, far beyond their borders affecting energy, alliances, you name it.
Yeah, that's a great starting point. We're really focusing in on the decade after 2011. It truly was a perfect storm for the Middle East and North Africa region. You had this convergence of popular uprisings, economic instability, and major geopolitical realignments. It challenged a status quo that had seemed solid for decades. Honestly, what many thought they knew about Gulf stability, it got completely turned on its head, revealing something much more complex and, frankly, more precarious.
Okay, let's unpack that. The Arab Spring in 2011, it wasn't just a small ripple, was it? Two regimes fell in a month. So for the Gulf monarchies, often seen as these, islands of stability, how did this perfect storm actually hit them? What was the immediate impact?
Well, the uprising started in North Africa, sure,
Uh-huh.
but they spread incredibly quickly across the Arabian Peninsula.
What?
We saw pretty significant opposition rallies in places like Oman, Kuwait, even Saudi Arabia's eastern province.
Yeah.
But the real flashpoint, the one that really sent shockwaves through the Gulf, was Bahrain. In March 2011, the Sunni ruling family, the Al Khalifa, faced massive protests from the Shia majority population. And this wasn't just contained, it escalated fast and triggered a very swift intervention by Saudi and UAE forces, the Peninsula Shield Force.
All right. And here's where it gets really interesting, because our sources suggest this wasn't just about suppressing internal dissent. A deep fault line quickly opened up across the whole region.
Absolutely, that's key. The uprisings basically carved out an ideological chasm. On one side, you had states like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Egypt. They were absolutely determined to stop new, ideologically driven groups, especially Sunni Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood, from taking power. The fear was palpable. Then on the other side, you had Turkey and Qatar, who were openly backing these very groups. They saw them as the future. This wasn't just a policy spat, it was a fundamental clash of visions. And it quickly spiraled into these devastating proxy wars in places like Syria and Yemen, which in turn dramatically heightened threat perceptions for the GCC states. Historically, they'd been mostly, let's say, security consumers, relying on the U.S. mainly. Now they were trying this unprecedented shift, trying to become security producers themselves.
So that idea of them being a unified security community, that pretty much fell apart quickly. What did that fragmentation mean for how each of these countries started to define security for themselves?
That's a crucial point. Yeah, the notion of a cohesive GCC security community really disintegrated after 2011. Each country experienced that wave of protests differently, based on their own specific domestic situation. Qatar, for example, saw almost no domestic impact. Very different story. Whereas Bahrain and Saudi Arabia faced large-scale anti-regime protests that genuinely shook the foundations of their rule. So this led to a fundamental shift in what security even meant. It moved away from traditional national security protecting borders, state interest towards regime security. It was really about the ruling families maintaining their own identity, their control, their sovereignty against forces they saw as hostile, whether internal or external.
So not just clear external threats. You mentioned this really interesting concept, intermestic threats. Can you break that down for us?
Right, intermestic threats. It's a fascinating term coined by Christian Ulrichsen, and it's central here. It basically describes threats that are a mix of external and internal elements. Think external actors exploiting internal vulnerabilities or internal issues having external implications, that kind of blend. And this became much, much more obvious after 2011. External events started having immediate internal resonance. The two main actors, or forces, shaping the GCC's security thinking were Iran and its proxies, and then the diverse range of Sunni Islamist groups, especially the Muslim Brotherhood. But, and this is critical how each monarchy viewed and prioritized these two forces, that varied massively across the Gulf.
Okay, let's dive into those different paths then. Starting with Saudi Arabia, they felt a very direct hit from the protests, particularly in their eastern province, which has that shared Shia population with Bahrain. What was their core worry?
For Saudi Arabia, Iran and its proxies were, without a doubt, the #1 threat. And it had this powerful intermestic angle. Riyadh saw Iran as actively trying to exploit their domestic weak spots. Specifically, the grievances of their Shia minority, who, felt systematically discriminated against in religion, jobs, politics. This tension reached a peak, tragically, with the execution of the prominent Shia cleric Nimr al-Nimr in 2016, which, as you'll remember, led to attacks on Saudi diplomatic missions in Iran and a complete severing of ties.
And the Muslim Brotherhood, you mentioned them as the other major perceived threat. Our sources talk about a Saudi group, the Islamic Awakening, or Al-Sawa. How did they fit into Riyadh's calculus?
Well, initially, the Sawa movement had a kind of cooperative, if sometimes tense, relationship with the government. But after the Arab Spring, they became much more critical of the regime's counter-revolutionary stance across the region. This shift led Saudi Arabia to designate the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization in 2014, and they began actively working to crush any form of Islamist dissent. The execution of Nimr al-Nimr and even the bulldozing of his hometown, Al-Umayyah. In 2017, these actions showed a kind of hyper-securitization, driven, our sources suggest, by this deep underlying ontological insecurity.
Ontological insecurity. That's a powerful term, so it's not just about geopolitics. It's like a fundamental unease about their own identity.
Exactly. It's a perceived vulnerability in the very identity and legitimacy of the Saudi state, tied to its founding history, its religious claims, its tribal structures. This internal fragility, combined with these external pressures, really shaped their actions. And the perception of Iran advancing, especially in Yemen, with the Houthis taking Sana'a, that was a huge driver.
Yeah, it really seemed to transform their whole view of the region.
Oh, absolutely. The idea of a Shia crescent Iranian influence stretching through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, suddenly looked like it was becoming a full moon, with Yemen included, from Riyadh's perspective. This sense of existential threat directly fueled the decision to launch the military operation in Yemen in 2015, and it also drove their fierce opposition to the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA. They believed it would just funnel more money to Iran's proxies.
But then, post-2019, something seems to shift again in their strategy. What triggered that?
Right. The attacks in 2019 on their oil facilities, Abqaiq and Khurais, massive attacks, and the perceived lack of a robust U.S. military response. That really shook Saudi confidence. Confidence in the U.S. as that ultimate security guarantor just eroded significantly. This led to what's been called a strategic pause, a move towards de-escalation with Iran, including direct talks. They also started mending fences with Qatar and Turkey, partly because the Muslim Brotherhood's regional star seemed to be waning anyway. It was a definite recalibration.
Okay, from Saudi Arabia's intense pressures, let's pivot to Bahrain. They faced, as you said, a similar challenge, maybe even more acutely given their demographics.
That's right. Bahrain faced huge protests in 2011. And the ruling family, the Al Khalifa, who are Sunni, quickly framed the Shia opposition as this major intermestic threat. And in their view, it was strongly linked to Iran. The intervention by Saudi and UAE forces under the Peninsula Shield banner, that was absolutely critical for the regime's survival, no question.
And their response domestically was pretty severe, wasn't it?
Extremely severe.
Yeah.
Bahrain pursued what some analysts call a securitization of the Shia problem. This involved banning the main Shia opposition party, Al-Wafaq, in 2016. They even accused Iran of biological aggression during the COVID pandemic. It shows how deep that threat perception runs, how sectarian it became. This very hard line, even though it risked tearing the social fabric apart, was driven by their vulnerability. They're a small state, heavily reliant on Saudi and Emirati money and muscle. Signing the Abraham Accords with Israel later on was also framed as adding another layer of deterrence against Iran.
Okay, let's move to the UAE. Unlike Saudi Arabia or Bahrain, they didn't face the same level of internal unrest. How did Abu Dhabi's threat perceptions develop?
But for the UAE, 2011 was definitely seen as an unwelcome challenge to the status quo. It forced them to think more regionally about their security. Iran was consistently viewed as an external threat. This goes back to historical issues, like the dispute over the 3 Gulf islands occupied by Iran in 1971. Their main focus regarding Iran was its regional behavior, particularly its posture around the Strait of Hormuz, which is vital for their economy.
But the Muslim Brotherhood that was perceived very differently, much more as an internal issue.
Yes, exactly. The Brotherhood, specifically its local affiliate, Al-Islah, was seen as a serious intermestic threat. Key figures like Mohammed bin Zayed have long held a deep personal animosity towards political Islam. They saw Al-Islah as capable of exploiting the UAE's own socioeconomic sensitivities and the delicate balance between the 7 different emirates. The crackdown on activists in 2011 even for just signing petitions, really underscores how concerned they were about maintaining federal unity and leadership control.
And like the Saudis, those 2019 attacks this time on tankers off their coast seemed to be a turning point for the UAE too.
Correct. Very similar reaction. The lack of a strong U.S. response after the tanker attacks, alongside the attacks on Saudi oil sites, cemented this view that the U.S. was disengaging. Trust was damaged. So this spurred the UAE to diversify its security arrangements. Normalizing ties with Israel via the Abraham Accords was part of that, again, seeking that extra layer of deterrence. But interestingly, they also moved to de-escalate tensions with Iran, holding maritime security talks and even sending COVID aid. And like Saudi Arabia, they also started rapprochement with Turkey as the Brotherhood's regional influence faded. Pragmatism seemed to take over.
Okay, shifting gears now to Kuwait, a fascinating contrast. They also had protests in 2011, but the focus seemed quite different.
Yeah, Kuwait's experience was distinct. The protests there were much more focused on institutional reform, socioeconomic issues, things like the status of the stateless Bedouin population or corruption allegations against the prime minister at the time, Nasser Mohammed. It wasn't really about overthrowing the system itself. Kuwait's political system, while not a full democracy, is semi-democratic. It has an active parliament, which provided channels for people to voice these grievances. That fostered a certain resilience.
And how did they view the big regional players, Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, Kuwait didn't really see Iran as an existential, full-fledged threat, despite some security incidents in the past, like the Abdali cell affair in 2015, which allegedly had Iranian links. Generally, Kuwait's Shia communities were seen as loyal Kuwaiti nationals. Similarly, the Muslim Brotherhood's local affiliate, Hadass, while an active opposition party, mostly operated within the rules of Kuwait's political game. They sought reform, not revolution.
Which explains why Kuwait often played the mediator role during the big GCC fallouts.
Exactly. Kuwait was the main mediator in both the 2014 rift and the big 2017 Qatar crisis. They have this deep-seated historical emphasis on internal balance, on maintaining a diverse national fabric. Open sectarian conflict spilling over was seen as an existential threat to their own stability. So their priority was stopping regional polarization from turning into dangerous intermestic threats at home, especially given their vulnerability, remember, the 1990 Iraqi invasion.
Yet, despite focusing on regional mediation, our sources mention some internal vulnerabilities were maybe quasi-neglected.
That's a fair point. While they were busy trying to keep the region balanced, long-standing issues like the Bedouin status and persistent corruption didn't get resolved. In fact, things arguably got worse with the double whammy of the COVID pandemic and the 2020 oil price crash. This fueled political crises, government resignations, and stalled crucial reforms like those needed for economic diversification away from oil. It shows the difficulty of that balancing act.
Okay, next up, Oman. Their experience during the Arab Spring seems particularly unique, almost an outlier in the Gulf. How did they handle it?
Oman really was different. The protests in 2011 were almost purely socioeconomic jobs, corruption, not really questioning the legitimacy of the regime. Protesters in Sohar actually apologized publicly to Sultan Qaboos, asking for reform, not for him to fall. This was partly because the protests lacked unified leadership, but mostly due to the immense personal legitimacy of Sultan Qaboos, who'd basically built the modern Omani state since 1970.
And their perception of Iran, that really stands out compared to their neighbors.
It's a critical difference. For Oman, historically, Iran was often seen as a stabilizing force, not a destabilizing one. Iran even helped the Sultan during the Darfur rebellion in the 70s. Oman's Shia communities are well integrated. There aren't major internal fault lines for Iran to exploit. Sultan Qaboos consistently resisted efforts to turn the GCC into an overt anti-Iran military alliance. Regional stability was paramount. They even viewed the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, positively as a potential boost for regional economic cooperation.
And the Muslim Brotherhood in Oman.
Their influence was described as pretty limited and underground. This was due to government crackdowns going back to the 90s, plus the fact that Sunnis aren't the majority in Oman anyway. Islamist groups' demands generally echoed the broader socioeconomic grievances. Interestingly, Oman criticized the crackdowns on the Brotherhood in Egypt after the coup, worrying it would push nonviolent groups towards radicalism.
So Oman's foreign policy was fundamentally about maintaining stability through neutrality and dialogue.
Precisely. Keeping regional balance, avoiding escalation, that was the absolute top priority. During the 2017 Qatar crisis, Oman declared neutrality. They opened their ports to Doha, which led to a huge jump in trade. This was driven by economic opportunity, yes, but also by a core desire to protect their independent foreign policy from regional pressures. After Sultan Qaboos passed away in 2020, there's been a heightened sense of vulnerability, a worry that bigger regional powers might try to exploit Oman's economic challenges for influence. So that balancing act is perhaps even more crucial now.
Okay, finally, let's look at Qatar. Like Oman, very little domestic dissent during the Arab Spring. How did that shape their, well, quite assertive regional security approach?
Qatar's situation was unique. A tiny native population, maybe 300,000 citizens, enjoying immense wealth from natural gas and a comprehensive welfare system. As the sources put it, they simply had too much at stake to push hard for democratic change. This gave the leadership huge confidence that the Arab Spring wasn't an existential threat at home, and that freed them up, really, to pursue a much more ambitious interventionist foreign policy elsewhere.
So while others saw threats, particularly from the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar saw opportunity.
It's exactly. Where Saudi Arabia and the UAE saw danger in the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, Doha saw a chance to expand its regional influence. They used realpolitik, their vast financial resources, to back Brotherhood-linked groups in Egypt, Libya, Tunisia. They genuinely seemed to believe these groups were best positioned to shape the post-uprising landscape. And of course, Al Jazeera, especially Al Jazeera Arabic, became a major platform for activists challenging the old regimes across the region, amplifying Qatar's influence significantly.
And their relationship with Iran, given the regional tensions, that was also managed differently.
For Qatar, Iran was viewed as an external risk to some of its regional interests. Maybe, but crucially, not an existential threat to the Qatari regime itself. In fact, Iran served as a vital strategic counterweight to Saudi Arabia's regional dominance. Especially important given they share sovereignty over the world's largest natural gas field, the South Pars North Dome field. That requires a working relationship. And Iran's support during the 2017 blockade, opening its airspace and waters when Saudi and the UAE closed theirs, that was absolutely critical for Qatar's economic survival and regime stability. Qatar even publicly advocated for dialogue between Tehran and its Arab neighbors, a clear break from the Saudi-UAE line.
That 2017 crisis, the blockade, must have been an incredibly challenging moment for them, though.
Oh, absolutely. Their most vulnerable moment since independence, probably. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt, the quartet, imposed a total blockade. They accused Qatar of breaking past security agreements, supporting terrorism, coordinating with opposition groups in Bahrain, serious charges. However, the crisis actually seemed to unify the Qatari population behind the leadership. And the support from Iran, plus forging an even closer alliance with Turkey, which established a military base there, really bolstered Qatar's resilience and sense of security. They managed to ride it out.
So fast forward through this incredibly turbulent decade, we see these intense, often conflicting security views within the GCC. What does the bigger picture look like now, especially regarding their place in the world order? How are they relating to traditional partners like the U.S.?
Well, the period after 2011, and especially after those 2019 attacks, marks a really significant shift. We've moved from decades of the GCC states being pretty closely aligned with the U.S. and Europe towards what analysts are calling strategic hedging. They're operating in a much more competitive, multipolar world now. The perception of U.S. retrenchment highlighted by the lack of response in 2019, the chaotic Afghanistan withdrawal, the whole JCPOA saga, it made these monarchies feel much less obligated to automatically align with Washington, especially if it clashed with their direct interests. They realized they needed to look out for themselves more.
So they're actively broadening their horizons, looking for new partners. What are the potential downsides or upsides of this hedging strategy for them?
It's definitely a calculated gamble. Yes, they're diversifying. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have signed major strategic partnership deals with both Russia and China. China is now the GCC's biggest trading partner, overtaking the EU. It's a top investor and increasingly a source of military hardware. The aim is clearly to strengthen their own defense capabilities and reduce that heavy historical reliance on the U.S. security umbrella. The risk? Well, navigating the competing interests of these global powers, the U.S., China, Russia, could get tricky. You risk alienating traditional allies if you lean too far one way. But the perceived upside for them is greater resilience, more autonomy, not having all their security eggs in one basket. It really just highlights, again, how deeply intertwined their internal security calculations are with these big global shifts.
It's clear the security picture in the Gulf is anything but simple. It's this complex web where regime survival often equals national security, and threat perceptions are shaped by history, domestic vulnerabilities, even individual leaders. It's a constant state of reassessment.
Precisely. And for outside powers, for anyone engaging with the region, the key takeaway really has to be, don't treat the GCC as a single entity. It's not a monolith. Effective engagement means understanding and maybe even addressing the specific vulnerabilities, socioeconomic, political, that shape each country's unique threat perceptions. For some, like Oman or Kuwait, maybe the focus is more on supporting institutional resilience, economic diversification. For others, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, it might involve acknowledging their concerns about intermestic threats, even while encouraging cautious de-escalation with rivals like Iran. It's nuanced.
Which leaves us with a final, quite provocative thought for you to consider. If external powers genuinely want to foster long-term stability in the Gulf, maybe the most effective approach isn't broad, overarching policies, but rather helping each individual monarchy navigate its own unique internal challenges. Challenges that, as we've explored today, are fundamentally linked to the security of the entire region and indeed, the world.